Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Andrés Mejía Acosta, and I am the Custer Family Dean, Associate Dean for Research, Policy, and Practice at the Keough School of Global Affairs. We are delighted to host this event celebrating 20 years of the Open Budget Survey, together with the International Budget Partnership and the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. It's a pleasure to welcome such a rich community of policy experts, civil society advocates, academics, practitioners, and friends, both here in person and joining us online. After 2 decades, and despite no shortage of challenges, the OBS remains the most comprehensive, reliable, and accessible tool for addressing budget transparency worldwide. Throughout this time, IBP has stayed firmly committed to making public money work for everyone. Through rigorous data collection and analysis, bold advocacy campaigns, and dialogue between citizens and their elected officials. You have seen the displays of their work in the hallway, and if you have a time, I encourage you to stop by the virtual reality station so you can quite literally see how transformative their work has been. IBP's impact shows us that we can all be agents of change in different ways and at different points in our lives. In my own case, IBP shaped my early career as a graduate student when I did country coding for the OBS. As a scholar, I drew on their data when writing about transparency and accountability for the extractive industries. And as a teacher, it's been a valuable resource to show students of my Politics of Public Finance class what happens when elected leaders make sovereign financial decisions using other people's money. Many of those students have gone on to build careers in public finance as academics themselves, policy experts, and development practitioners. As a dean of a policy school devoted to integral human development, I can't think of a better moment to celebrate and support this work. At a time of growing mistrust in government and electoral polarization, the OBS steps in to give people the tools to ask informed questions, hold their leaders accountable, and demand better service provision. That is a way of protecting human dignity. As researchers, we are reminded that our work is quite relevant to inform policy through comparative evidence, and to sharpen our own research questions by listening to the challenges of practitioners face every day. Let me close by thanking my colleagues at Keough School's Washington office, Director Maura Policelli and Maria Rossi, as well as all of our IBP colleagues, including probably Patricia, Cindy, David, Elena, Sally, Bright, and many, many others working behind the scenes to bring today's event to life. Please join me in thanking them with applause for them. I will now hand over to Ms. Mtegha-Gelders, Head of Public Finance Management at FCDO, for some welcoming remarks. That's good.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. It is really a pleasure to join today's event on the Open Budget Survey. And huge thanks to Patricia and the wider team for convening this, really get together under the theme that goes to the heart of public finance, i.e. making public money work for all. I'd like to make some 3 points on behalf of the UK, and thank you very much for this opportunity to do so. First, on the UK's partnership with IBP and on the Open Budgets agenda. Second, on what the Open Budget Survey has achieved over the past few decades, 2 decades, and I promise I won't steal thunder from those that will talk to some of these core content issues in the room. And third, on why this agenda matters even more in a volatile, ambiguous, and contested world, very much echoing the earlier remarks. First, on the UK's partnership and support. For the UK, fiscal transparency has never been a narrow technical agenda. It is central to credible public financial management, accountable government, and public trust. Across DFID, for those who knew DFID then, and now FCDO, the UK has been a sustained institutional partner of the International Budget Partnership and the Open Budget Survey, including through core support to IBP's work on budget transparency, accountability, and participation. But it has never been just about funding a survey. The UK has been at the heart of shaping and sustaining the global architecture of fiscal transparency through norms, evidence, institutions, and accountability coalitions that make open budgets meaningful. That includes support to open budgets, open contracting, support to legislative scrutiny, supreme audit institutions, and support to civil society organizations that help citizens follow their money and engage with budget choices. Together, this has helped to strengthen the wider fiscal accountability ecosystem. So when the UK speaks about the Open Budget Survey, we are speaking as a long-term partner in the evidence, the coalitions, institutional capabilities that have helped to make fiscal transparency a serious global reform agenda. Second, what the Open Budget Survey has achieved. Over the past 2 decades, the Open Budget Survey has done something distinctive. It has turned fiscal transparency from an aspiration into measurable, comparable, and actionable evidence. Since its launch in 2006, it has given governments, parliaments, audit institutions, civil society, and development partners a shared basis for asking 3 simple but demanding questions. What do governments publish? How are the public finances scrutinized? And does the public have a real voice in budget decisions? That matters because transparency is often claimed, but not always practiced. A budget document sitting on a website does not, by itself, create accountability. Accountability comes when information is timely, accessible, and used. It is when parliaments can interrogate fiscal choices, when audit institutions can follow the money, and when citizens have meaningful opportunities to shape and question decisions made in their name. That is the survey's power. It does not let us stop at publication. It pushes us to ask whether budget information is usable, whether oversight is effective, and whether participation can influence real choices. It has also evolved. The OBS expanded in coverage, deepened its analytical power, and moved from transparency measurement towards a broader accountability and reform platform. The recent UK-supported OBS debt accountability model is a good example. Piloted alongside the 2025 assessment across 11 countries, it looks at whether transparency, participation, and oversight conditions allow the public to hold governments accountable for public debt management. That is exactly the kind of evolution we need. A survey that can respond to today's fiscal realities, not simply one that measures yesterday's transparency practices. Third, looking ahead. This agenda is becoming more important, not less. We are operating in a more volatile, ambiguous, and contested world. Fiscal space is tighter, debt pressures are higher, climate and fiscal risks are sharper, and governments are being asked to do more with less room for maneuver. That was also the message from finance ministers during a fiscal resilience roundtable we co-convened with partners at our recent Global Partnerships Conference. Fiscal pressure is now inseparable from questions of credibility, trust, and legitimacy. In that context, budgets become the place where hard choices are made visible between debt service and service delivery, between immediate pressures and long-term investment, and between competing claims on limited public resources. those choices do not become easier by being hidden. They become more legitimate when governments are open about the constraints they face, when fiscal risks are disclosed, and when citizens can see how priorities are being set. That is why the next phase of the Open Budgets agenda cannot simply be about more publication. It is about usable transparency, meaningful participation, and effective scrutiny. And that is also why the Open Budget Survey remains so valuable. Its real value is not just as an index, but as a platform for change, bringing governments, parliaments, audit institutions, civil society, and the wider society as a whole around a shared diagnosis of strengths, gaps, and reform priorities. The UK is proud to have been a long-term partner in this work, but the task ahead is different from the task 20 years ago. We all acknowledge that. In a more contested fiscal world, the question is not simply whether governments publish more, it is whether fiscal openness is strong enough to support accountability, credibility, and trust when public choices are hardest. That is why the OBS matters. It turns openness into evidence and evidence into a platform for reform and action. I look forward to the discussion and thank you very much.
Thank you, Chigomezgo, for your nice words. And now I'd like to introduce Mr. Rodrigo Valdés, Director of Fiscal Affairs Department at the International Monetary Fund.
Good morning, and thank you, Andrés, for the introduction, and Patricia for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you for the launch of the 2025 Open Budget Survey and to celebrate 2 decades of remarkable work by International Budget Partnership. 20 years ago, many governments did not routinely publish their budgets. Today, the expectation has become far more widely accepted, and that is real progress. Over these 20 years, the survey has done something truly valuable. It has helped make fiscal transparency visible, measurable, and comparable across countries. And importantly, it has shown that transparency is not an abstract principle, it's a practical foundation for better governance outcomes. Today, in these remarks, I would like to make three points. First, why fiscal transparency matters more than ever today. Second, what we're learning from practice, both from the survey and from the work that we do at the IMF. And third, where the reform agenda should go next. So let me start with why transparency matters. Fiscal transparency is often described as a pillar of governance. That is correct, but it's more than that. Transparency is what follows fiscal policy to work. At the fund, we place the highest importance on 2 objectives. First, efficiency of public spending, and second, accountability to citizens and taxpayers. And transparency sits at the core of both. Without transparency, governments cannot allocate resources efficiently because they lack full and a reliable picture of public finances. And without transparency, citizens and oversight institutions cannot hold governments accountable. In other words, transparency is not a communication exercise. It has that, but it's much more. It's a core fiscal policy tool that supports better decisions, stronger institutions, and ultimate public trust. And trust is particularly critical today. Public debt dynamics are complex in many economies today. Fiscal space is constrained, and difficult policy decisions on spending, taxation, and reform are unavoidable. In such an environment, policy cannot succeed without public support. And that support depends fundamentally on confidence that public resources are used well, and that governments are being transparent about risks and trade-offs. Let me now turn to what we have been learning in practice, both from the Open Budget Survey and our IMF fiscal transparency evaluations. At the fund, we have now conducted 44 fiscal transparency evaluations, including 11 in low-income countries, and a few updates over time. These assessments and increasingly analytical tools, including large language models applied to our reports, offer some important insights. I would like to highlight 4 key findings. First, one of the most persistent gaps is coverage. Too often, key parts of the public sector remain outside the core budget and fiscal reports and public discussion. Extra budgetary entities, public corporations, guarantees, and contingent liabilities, for example. And without this full picture, deficit, debt, and risks are systematically underestimated. Second, across our evaluations, fiscal risk analysis and management consistently, those risks emerge as the weakest pillar of what we find in different countries. And yet, this is precisely where transparency matters the most. Many fiscal crises do not come from unknown risks, but from risks that were known, but not properly disclosed, quantified, or managed. In our analytical work, we find that the stock flow adjustment, that is the difference between the accumulation of debt that you can trace from the budget and things that happen outside the budget, account for a large share of debt accumulation. In the Middle East and North Africa, for example, about 50 percentage points of all total debt dynamics are explained by this part that we don't discuss in a budget. In South Africa, since 2008, about 40% of the accumulation, again, is something that we don't discuss. So primary balances are important, but there is much more happening outside what we discussed in our annual cycles. This finding has also shaped the IMF's capacity development work. We have expanded our support to countries in identifying, quantifying, disclosing, and managing fiscal risks, from what's going on in public state enterprises, guarantees, PPPs, arrears, natural disasters, and climate-related shocks. And it's very important that we are pushing for integrating these systematically into budget documents, into fiscal risk statements, and medium-term fiscal frameworks. This underscores a simple but powerful point. What is not transparently reported can become what destabilizes public finances. This evidence reinforces the practical direction of the CD work that the fund and others do, helping countries move from partial disclosure of risks toward active risk monitoring, mitigation, and decision-making. Third point is that accountability is lagging behind transparency. The survey shows, and you will see from Patricia soon, that transparency has improved, but accountability has not kept pace. More documents are published, but oversight, public participation, and follow-through remain weak. In particular, budget execution remains less transparent, fiscal risks are insufficiently disclosed, and audit findings are not systematically acted upon. This reveals an important gap. Publishing information is not enough. What matters is whether it is used to hold governments accountable. My own experience in government was that we publish tons. Impossible to follow through. So the quality of the publication is probably as important as the volume running. From the IMF's perspective, and this is my fourth point, the Open Budget Survey is a very, very important complement to our. While our evaluations provide deep diagnostic at one point in time, the survey tracks progress over time within countries and also captures how transparency translates into a broader accountability ecosystem. The dynamic perspective is extremely valuable, especially in reminding us that progress is gradual and that reforms need to be sustained. Third point I want to make is, so what do we do from here? Let me highlight 3 quick points. First, close the gaps in financial risks and coverage. I mentioned already this, no? The first priority is to strengthen transparency where it matters the most. Fiscal risks, guarantees SOEs, natural resources management. Second, coverage of public sector institutions and balance sheets, and the completeness of information on assets and liability. They're not merely technical details, are really central to fiscal sustainability. Second point is to make transparency more actionable. Is from moving from publishing more to making it usable. As the survey emphasizes, transparency must be timely, accessible, and actionable. These were digital tools and modern public financial management systems can play a very important role, provide more frequent, granular, and usable data. Before I joined the fund, among different hats that I used to use, at the fund we use only one, I was part of the board of an NGO called Observatorio Fiscal in my country, in Chile. And there we sought to turn dry government data into clear, engaging visuals. And it was a super valuable effort, but almost entirely dependent on the energy and resources of one person. So that left me thinking, okay, what should take this role? A strong civil society is, of course, the ideal answer. But in many cases, it lacks the capacity and the resources to do so consistently. One promising alternative, and this is more of a homework for the IBP, is to engage with councils. Fiscal councils are becoming a very important player in the fiscal ecosystem, and they are probably a good partner for this effort. Final point going forward is to strengthen the link between transparency and accountability. These two things are reinforcing, but we need to do more to empowering congresses, institutions, civil society, and ensure follow-up. Let me conclude with one simple message. Fiscal transparency is not an end in itself. At the end of the day, it's what public money works for everybody. And this is very important these days when we have really fiscal pressures in many countries. The Open Budget Survey has been very instrumental in advancing this agenda of spending better over the last 20 years. And the partnership of you, the fund, and other organizations is clearly critical for this to move forward. Strong public finances require not only sound policies, but also trust, as I mentioned at the beginning, and transparency at the end of the day is what builds trust. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. Thank you, everyone, for being here today to celebrate with us this important milestone. I am Patricia Muñoz, IBP's Executive Director. Of course, the Keough School that is hosting us today. I joined IBP 3 years ago. I think the second or third email I got was from Andrés saying, "Oh, I'm also Ecuadorian, very excited to see you. I've been working with the OBS since I have memory," something like that. Not exactly. I think by the then we got a call right away. By the second sentence, I was already saying, "Let's do something." And here we are. And then I was trying to remember when I met Chigomezgo, and also the third sentence I said with her was like, "Let's do something together." So be careful when you meet with me. It may happen. So Rodrigo, a lot of things to be done with the IMF, although we have great partnerships already. So this started 20 years ago as an experiment, as a pilot. the premise that government needed to be transparent. What we've heard today from Chico, from Rodrigo, is that transparency is one of the most basic things. It's taken as a given, it's taken as a norm, but we cannot take it for granted. We heard just now that it's not about transparency, it's about the trust that this entails. We heard that it's not about transparency, it's about the platform for reform that this can bring about. And this is what the Open Budget Survey has been. So today we're going to summarize 20 years in 5 minutes, and it is possible. So for those who don't know the Open Budget Survey, it measures accountability in budgets with 3 pillars. Transparency, looking at whether documents are available in a timely manner, in a comprehensive manner. But what is information without people using it? So we also measure participation and whether there are opportunities to engage in key moments of the budget cycle. But participation without follow-through, it's not enough. So we also measure whether there's oversight from both legislators and also audit institutions, whether they have the authority and they're fulfilling their duty to do so. So over time. As you will see here, this chart shows the 3 pillars over time on averages. In this case, since 2017. And as Rodrigo already mentioned, there's a lot to celebrate. There's actually an upward trajectory of the transparency index that you see at the score in the middle. So yes, kudos there for most countries that have improved. You see an increase in participation, still the lowest score, but actually the highest increases in participation. And unfortunately, on oversight, you pretty much see a flat line there. So there's a lot to be done on oversight. Now, these are averages. They always hide a lot of things behind it. And so what the next chart is going to show you, and this is what is beautiful about the Open Budget Survey that is implemented across the globe, is that actually you can see and dice the data in different ways and, for example, analyze it by different regions. This is only showing the transparency score, and you can see that this holds true for each one of the regions except South Asia. That is, transparency has increased since 2008 until this latest score. It has increased by 29%. 2/3 of countries have shown increases since we started measuring transparency in their locations. You already heard a little bit about what's interesting about the survey. What's interesting behind the 13,000 indicators are these important topics where we need to pay attention. And so what you see here, what I want to draw your attention to, these are the different parts of the budget cycle. You can see that the approval phase, actually, it's doing quite well across the 3 pillars. But I want you to see the drop that exists from the approval process to the execution. So even if governments do everything right and we celebrate and we applaud all the documents that exist, if nothing happens in the execution, we are in big trouble. A lot of the work we've done actually has been focusing on budget credibility, that is the underspend or overspend. And not only the data is not there, is that all these actors are not talking about it. As we jump to the next slide, I want to bring back something that Rodrigo put it down forever. What is not reported, I may be misquoting, but I think this is the message. What is not reported can destabilize public finances. So this is very serious. This is not about doing better in the Open Budget Survey. What cannot be measured cannot be changed. And so what I'm going to talk with these 3 quick statistics is a few things there. We already saw that execution, we're not doing great. But what is even worse is that we're not paying attention to the other side of the public finance equation, the revenue. How can we achieve more equitable outcomes? At IBP, we are in the business of making sure equitable outcomes exist. And transparency and the survey is one tool to get us there. How can a country meet the needs of the population, especially those who have been marginalized, if we don't have information on domestic revenue mobilization? And one way this is expressed is on the total almost lack of information in some countries on tax expenditures. 55% of countries in the latest survey published nothing, nada, zero, information on tax expenditures. Tax expenditures, in a very simple way of saying, is the amount of money that the government does not receive, that the government forgoes because of some exclusions in the tax system, some deductions, all, yes, nice legal provisions. In some countries, this is as big as the entire budget for health. And yet, it is not available when the budget is discussed. How can we reform tax expenditures if the information is not available in more than 50% of the countries? Now, if this does not convince you, maybe debt will. Because in less than 4 years, debt over GDP is going to be 100% around the world. And there's a lot of complexity. We have experts here from the legal department and other places from the IMF that can give you more details. 50%, half of the countries don't publish information on the ones that we assessed on the debt composition. Now, I'm not making a judgment call here on whether internal debt or external debt is good or bad. I'm not even getting there. Well, I can't get there because the information is not available, because parliaments are not scrutinizing. They're not even asking the question about that because information is not there when it should be. And so it's not surprising, and this ties with a little bit of what Rodrigo said, that 82% of countries do not provide information on long-term fiscal outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean that the information does not exist. Actually, the most fascinating places where we've seen change like this, and my colleagues can tell you where, is where we know the information is, just someone decided it was not important enough to have all the accountability actors grapple with this data and ask the tough questions. So a lot to be done here. But I would like to finish with the bright spots. Every time you go to a report, and this time we've made releases of the Open Budget Survey regionally, so you can spend hours and hours watching all of those. We highlight stories of change in the most complex environments, under the most, in countries with in different regions, with different income levels, we see change possible. We have Dominican Republic and Benin that has the highest increases across all countries in transparency. We have changes in innovation in Jordan. And when those changes are not possible at the national level, we see innovation at the municipal level on participation. We see that the Ministry of Finance in Guatemala used to be the head of the civil society organization that was the Open Budget Survey researcher way back then. And you can see here just some examples just to pique your curiosity, and so you can go there and ask questions to the work here. The common ingredient, you have a combination of civil society working with government champions, institutions that have the capacity and the willingness and the political will to make it happen, oversight institutions, both parliaments and audit institutions that know that budgets matter. They matter because they reflect a government's priorities. So I think that's it from me, because you're going to hear even more interesting challenges from our panel today. So I would like to invite back Andrés to run us through the next part of the today. Thank you so much.
This is where we continue with the in-depth conversation around the specific section of this framing. And so far, we've heard how the open budget has shown considerable improvements in changing and expanding the capacity to show more transparency, but how this transparency translates into effective accountability or even development outcomes is not so clear. So one part of the explanation is that most consequential public finance decisions, as we heard today, are not visible, are not open to the public, especially when it comes to taxation, spending, and debt. They still happen outside public scrutiny. And despite considerable efforts to mobilize civil society actors, citizens still have minimal information about or knowledge about who bears the burden of taxation, who benefits from exceptions, whether tax and spending choices together advance equity, or whether sovereign borrowing will expand future provision at any given point. As we heard, the data that Ana Patricia showed, there's evidence that many citizens, even though they would be willing to pay taxes, they are still unsure how the government uses those taxes. So there's growing mistrust on that side. And the OBS finds that half of the assessed countries disclose nothing about tax expenditures. Only one of 11 countries publish borrowing plans that link borrowing to specific sectors or projects. So when citizens are unable to see what is the benefit from their paying taxes, there's also a direct connection to a decline in support for democracy. If citizens don't feel represented, they don't feel that their tax contribution lead to something tangible, they start opting out of the fiscal contract. They start looking at, and we have research from Latin America showing how citizens begin to self-provide education or health or security, because there's no point in helping governments or paying governments to do that job when governments don't actually do it. So you start seeing the emergence of alternative third-party providers, sometimes private sectors, sometimes not so transparent sectors, but there is an encroachment of government functions by other parties. And this further erodes the fiscal contract. So it has a direct linkage to the democratic question. We have a fantastic panel of speakers to discuss how can the Open Budget Survey, which is a powerful budget transparency tool, as we've seen, can advance accountability in the management of public finances. And one point that has been made, but political scientists would say that the gap between transparency and accountability is political. That gap is about institutions, incentives, coalitions, structures. So I want to take this conversation going beyond the formal reporting and discuss the political incentives and coalitions needed across different actors, so civil society, parliament, treasury, oversight institutions, to make budgets and elected officials accountable for producing more equitable and fair outcomes. Joining this conversation, we have John Keough, Deputy Executive Director of Budget Hub, one of Kenya's leading civil society organizations working on budget accountability in Africa. And Karen Groen, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institute. Thank you for joining us. We have a tight podcast format, and I'll ask 2 rounds of questions to our speakers, giving you 4 minutes each, and then ask your concluding remarks to finish up our panel in the remaining 20 minutes or so. And then we will move on to the next panel, which will be led by my colleague, Gustavo Flores Macias. So my first question to John. Kenya is a good example of this growing gap between formal budget transparency and fiscal accountability. Despite the country having relatively robust disclosure systems, OBS in your own work show that Kenya has what's called a leaking fiscal plumbing in terms of there's been incomplete reporting on what debt-funded projects deliver, no statutory deadlines for debt implementation reporting, non-disclosure of liabilities, and so forth. What would you say is the main cause for this fiscal opacity? Is it the lack of effective formal reporting tools, or the lack of a state capacity to enforce and implement, or is there a design, a deliberate design intended to preserve this opacity? And if you can comment, what is your organization doing to close this gap?
Thanks, Andrés. And in 4 minutes, I start now. So definitely Kenya is one of the countries that has quite some good transparency around the budget at the national level, but also we have a decentralized system, so also at the sub-national level. And there's been progressive improvement in terms of the information that is available. But the incentive, of course, has been one of the things that I think has been an area of caution. for those of us who work in public finance, because as Patricia said, the disclosure has improved, but in some areas it has not. State-owned enterprises and the debt liabilities they have. Conversations around public-private partnership, which is a huge approach that the government is taking now to finance the budget because of the fiscal space there. So the fiscal incentive for government to be transparent and accountable in some areas definitely remains a challenge. Now, the tools to be transparent are there. The tools to be accountable are there. But the institutions have been a bit slow to it. So let me start with Parliament, right? So Parliament has to be the place where we manage the deficit, is the place where all the implementation reports go to every quarter, where Parliament is supposed to arrest some of the challenges that come with poor delivery of services and generally where accountability gaps exist. So there's still an institutional incentive problem that I think Kenya has to work on, and all of us are trying to drive that. And one way to drive it, which is one thing we've been doing is to try and ask what is the connection between all this budget information we have now and the lived realities of communities, right at the lowest levels. And that has driven us a bit to say, so we have more information now. How can we draw it into evidence that helps make that connection between all this information we have about what the budget is promising versus why is there a gap when it comes to the delivery of those services? And so that has meant kind of going at connecting things like the cost of living. Households in Kenya and around the world today care a lot about the cost of living, right? So tight fiscal spaces means government are trying to raise more taxes, but at the same time, austerity measures kick in at that point. So we've been working to try and bring that connection. So for example, there's a study we put out early this year that showed every increase by a percentage point in debt servicing is actually in the long run reducing the funding for social services by 3%. Now, when you take that to organizations that are working in the front lines, whether it's in the health sector, in social protection, that makes sense. That makes sense to them. So the local accountability work that we are trying to drive as Budget Hub together with other partners is then bringing this community organization that have more social capital to demand more of government into the space, right? As we were saying earlier, how do we bring more of these community voices into the space? And so bringing those communities with that kind of evidence, which some together, means then they come with more social capital to demand better of government. And when you bring them to the national space to meet with the national treasury, like the photos that are on the screen, then immediately the national treasury says, we need to sit down with these communities and hear what they are saying. Yeah. So this information that is coming out from the OBS and the county budget transparency that we do in Kenya becomes the oil that kind of makes this connection happen. Yeah. Becomes the place where you connect this evidence that is generated together with community level organizations that have the social capital to make that demand. So I think there's an institutional challenge that we are trying to look at, but there's also an opportunity where when you bring those who have a bigger ask, a bigger stake into the discussions around budgets, then you start seeing how this transparency movement actually fuels that level of conversation. And we are seeing it paying off quite a bit. Yeah. In fact, in the county budget transparency survey in the last 2 years, the biggest portion of improvement we've seen is actually county governments, the subnational governments in Kenya, actually publishing more budget implementation than they were doing before. Because the demand now is at the point of what are you doing with the money, not just what did you approve. Sure. So I think there's something there that we can definitely work on, but good signs.
And certainly putting a number to that gap, yes, illustrate and communicate that need for mobilization. Thank you. Karen, your most recent work with Julia Mascagni looks at how fiscal policies shape policymaking, which obviously I'm delighted to read that. More specifically, you look at the impact of ideology in the ruling party, political fragmentation would have on such as gender equitable fiscal policies that would encourage female labor force participation or state-supported approach to care. in this short time, unfortunately, could you elaborate a little bit whether the discussion and adoption of equitable gender policies is also suffering from this increased political polarization, democratic backsliding, the gender backslash, and what can be done to encourage voters to overcome these threats and demand for greater inclusion?
That's a huge question. I'm not going to answer all of it, but I'm going to claim 30 additional seconds to say how much I admire the International Budget Partnership. And remember when Bob Greenstein, who's here, started the Center on Budget Priorities, and Warren Krafchick in the early years did this. And I just love watching the expansion. And when I finally met Patricia, I was one of those people within 2 seconds of, let's do something together. So I was caught by that. So that's 30 seconds you won't penalize me for. I edited a compendium, Brookings compendium last year with 13 chapters that looked at innovations in public finance and fiscal policy through the lens of gender equality. I'm an economist, and I have a long association with Julia Mascagni, who heads the International Center for Tax and Development. And as part of this compendium, we have in the past written about moving towards a holistic approach to fiscal policy, looking at gender equality through the lens of both tax as well as expenditure. I hope to speak about that in the next round. But for this compendium, we decided we needed to venture out of our comfort zones as economists into the realm of politics. And partly that was motivated because of the backlash around the world towards women's rights, notably around issues of sexual and reproductive health, but just women's roles more generally in public participation. With Julia, we know that there are important technical solutions out there. In fact, both of us have written about that for at least 20 years. And we know about the kinds of things that fiscal policy can do, both on the revenue side as well as on the expenditure side. But ultimately, whether those technical solutions get adopted and succeed really depends on the politics. And this is the missing link between fiscal policy and actually achieving the kinds of outcomes that we have been writing about for many years. And we argue from a perspective that it's not just about gender equality, but other forms of equality, whether it's across income or other things. So we need to unpack the concept of fiscal politics to understand how reform actually happens. And we propose some ideas for how we would go about that, looking at narratives, actors, and processes. But when I come back to gender equality, one of the things that nobody has written about is how there are narratives about gender equality. I refer to two stylized narratives that really accord with other narratives about the size of the state, about the role of the public sector versus the private sector, and these narratives are intertwined. So one narrative, and this is very prominent in the backlash, is the narrative of the male breadwinner model. And when you look around this, you can see how this narrative is actually embedded in a country's fiscal stance. In this narrative, women are the caregivers, men are the breadwinners, and a typical fiscal signatures include things like joint personal income taxation, spending programs that reinforce women's unpaid caregiving roles, support for maternal and child benefits over women's rights and health. And it's also very much reflected in things that I've worked on and things like the nature of deductions and exemptions that are accorded to male breadwinners who, as opposed to females, some of whom may be working informally in other things. But when you go through tax systems, you see a lot of these things. And then on the expenditure side, these narratives tend to exclude collective responsibility for things like caregiving, leaving it to basically families or to the markets. And by contrast, we draw a picture of an egalitarian narrative that emphasizes more balance between work and family for everybody. And on the revenue side, you'd see individual filing. I'm sorry to go into some of the tax side, but individual filing and PIT design that actually encourages female labor participation. The expenditure side would reflect allocations towards a range of policies and services that also encourage female labor force participation, but also a redistribution between unpaid care and the public sector and the private sector, making it more of a collective responsibility. So these are very stylized pictures, and they differ, of course, according to any context. But I think you get the point about having to interrogate the ways in which these norms and ideologies are embedded in a fiscal policy stance. And I think that's important for understanding those for reform efforts. Now we have very powerful political coalitions that are pushing these narratives currently in a number of countries around the world. And I think to counter those narratives, it's really important, as you have suggested, to make sure that citizen movements, citizen engagement, and it's not just, I love the budgeting, civil society, participatory budgeting, but we need allies across the board. This is where the work that your organization is doing with gender responsive budgets, with women's movements, with other grassroots organizations is really important to bridge the kind of pressure for transparency and accountability. We also, and I'll say a little bit more about this in the next round, need to really work on changing narratives and paradigms. But I want to make a point that I think is important now, and I'll conclude with this. And this actually reinforces work that I supported as a program officer at the MacArthur Foundation 30 years ago. I supported a series of economic networks that were revisiting what was called the equity efficiency trade-off, arguing that there is not necessarily a trade-off, that actually greater equity can be efficient. And I think it's really important to come back to this point now, that there's not necessarily a trade-off between equity and efficiency and growth. But right now we know that equity is not very high on the political agenda. And I think that we can do much more to bring that back. And I'm very encouraged by movements toward bringing more tax fairness, tax justice through the technical work on why progressive tax systems are important and increase efficiency, but also growth, bringing back a move towards wealth taxation, inheritance taxation. I think the focus on bringing the DRM, the domestic resource mobilization side, into the conversation on what we can do on the budgeting side, that link needs to be much tighter and going forward. And I think the more we think about how, and I'll say a bit about this, how we can change our own narrative and argue across the board for some of these things, the stronger we'll be.
Yeah, and certainly making it explicit, these conversation about traditional female roles, because they underlie a very powerful fiscal inequities moving forward. Thank you. John, your work with Budgeting Hub and the Oka-Chumi Coalition has made continued effort to make increased public awareness, work on advocacy, demand more participation in decision-making. And unfortunately, and for the rest of the audience, if you haven't learned this, just over a week ago, a meeting convened by civil societies, organizations like yours, to examine a country's budget and discuss spending proposals for the 26th fiscal year was disrupted by violent attacks when participants gathered at All Saints Cathedral Church in Nairobi were attacked. Who would want to interrupt and harm a budget oversight meeting, I asked, at a church? And was there any specific proposal that would prompt this deliberate effort to intimidate civil society from scrutinizing these government actions? And more to the point, I'm asking a lot in 4 minutes, but what actions are being taken, or what actions can be taken to safeguard the citizens' constitutional right to ask questions?
Thanks, Andrés, for that. Yeah, I was in the meeting, actually.
You were in the meeting.
I was on video, yes, which anyway. So it was quite unfortunate that a meeting that basically is convened every try and look at what proposals the government has put out and what they mean, trying to get people to understand the kind of choices and trade-offs that need to be made that could turn out, to be disrupted by what now in Kenya are called goons. It's just people come and disrupt public meetings. It's an election year, so there's quite a bit of that happening now. But don't expect it in a budget meeting. So why and who disrupted, we are still yet to, because the government has been become a huge conversation in Kenya. And so the government has been quick to arrest some of the guys who did the disruption and take them to court, which is all good. But I think for me, the reflection of what happened then, and which I think is not unique when we are discussing budgets, I think it was a not very polite reminder that budgets are political more than they are technical.
Yeah.
Right. So it's about incentives. It's about the choices that government is making. In the current fiscal pressures that we see in countries like Kenya, the drive to try and get more fiscal consolidation happening, whether it's more taxes being proposed, austerity measures being brought in, is that within that, then we've created some radioactive level of engagement that comes with those choices. Because then we are determining, who gets taxed, who is benefiting from government programs, who is missing out. And when you bring all that together, then the question of the incentives behind that then become a big place of discussion in that case. So for us, one of the things that I think has been critical in thinking about what can be done, I think for civil society organizations, what we are doing in that meeting has to continue happening.
Yeah.
In fact, one person after the meeting joked and said that he's worked in the public space for 3 decades on public finance, and nobody has ever cared about a post-budget meeting. For him, this was an achievement. I don't know, because right now he's the advisor to the president of the economy, so he's an interesting gentleman. But I think getting a bigger movement to care about budgets and to place the incentive that government has to justify the trade-offs it's making, then becomes a good place to make sure that budget conversations don't get lost, because the incentives and the decisions being made might be uncomfortable in some quarters. If those who need and depend on government services get a bit more, as we were saying earlier, I think that brings an important place. And for us, as budget, some of the coalitions we are in, like Okoa Uchumi, we've been really keen, especially on conversations around public debt, to take it a little bit more to the grassroots, right? And try and get people at the grassroots to understand that public debt is not just a way government raises money, right? It's also an important part of the services that you get. So where is that debt being spent? Even geographically, where are the investments when it comes to? And when that is carried by a wider movement of organizations, I think that definitely becomes very helpful in making sure the civic space doesn't get closed in, because that can really happen. Budget hub, we even organize clusters of what we call regional budget hubs that cover the whole country. So whichever part of the country you go to, you will get those community level organizations trying to drive that conversation. But I think even for the wider non-state space, including the private sector, I think one of the things that we have to think of carefully is how do we curate very carefully but consistently the spaces of engagement with government. Because for me, what happened, 2 weeks ago, for me is also a big symptom. Public trust is really on the fringes when it comes to the relationship between government and citizens. And so making sure that those spaces remain, and there's a place where the kind of information we are discussing, what the OBS has really brought to life around the world, and even in countries where it's happening at the sub-national level, is that then you have spaces where not only do we have a discussion about what's the choices, the justification by government on why it's making certain choices becomes a norm, rather than something that is a bit more episodic.
Yeah.
One of the boards outside shows how many governments are involving the public. It's at half. But how many are actually coming to give feedback on what they did with citizen input is what, 8%? Hope I'm not killing that number. Is 8%, right? So these spaces have to be places where that kind of conversation 360 and that connection is coming in well. But globally, the norms we set, right? The norms we set as the IMF, the norms we set as IBP, the norms we set in the coalitions we're in globally, also become an important place of making sure that governments are going beyond just compliance, and actually they see the engagement with citizens as a place that actually builds their credibility, builds the trust of the decisions they are making. And so I think as international actors, when we are working on issues to do with public finance, is also we want to make sure we are creating norms that then can be customized into countries, can be normalized in terms of how governments operate, and then we don't see the kind of scenario that we saw
And ironically, this attack on a secret budget meeting enhances the importance, and it shows how critical this is. So maintaining this narrative of the need to speak more loudly and with larger coalitions about these gaps. Karen, your published work with Brookings has proposed the adoption of a new fiscal paradigm that promotes patient, long-term financing mechanisms that enhance strategic investment in social development outcomes. This shift would privilege investments that enhance productive capacities, climate resilience, inclusive growth, and such as care systems, which is very powerful and a very innovative way to think about the technical questions like borrowing. Coming back to the fiscal politics approach that we discussed, which political actors should help decide whether new borrowing is to finance this new care infrastructure, and what would prevent from the traditional political actors disguising these qualitative priorities, these development priorities, to disguise conventional everyday political spending. And would this proposed new paradigm is intended as an advocacy frame for civil society, or do you think there is traction for IMF and other organizations to look at this paradigm seriously and start rethinking how they allocate debt?
Let me, that's a great, again, long question to answer, but let me maybe start with a few words about the paradigm and why I think that's important, and come then to some of the actors. So, and I'm going to be a little heterodox in this group of people, because this paradigm challenges the dominance of financial actors and markets and powerful, whether they're oligarchs or corporations, in fiscal policy making. We don't necessarily see their role as lobbyists, as behind the scenes, deal brokers, etc. So I think it's important to basically move to a different paradigm as opposed to this very short-term stance that governs what countries think they need to do. So on the first reforming, I think we need to think about the quality of debt, not just the quantity of debt. Debt can do good things, but debt can do bad things, but it can also do good things. And we need to really think about the maturity, the purpose, the development impact at the center of debt sustainability discussions. There's a number of us who have been thinking about new instruments and assessment frameworks that distinguish between borrowing for consumption and borrowing for investments that can expand a country's productive and social base. And I'll come back to that in a minute. A second paradigm shift is redefining fiscal space. And we've heard a lot from the earlier speakers, and even you, John, referenced it, not as a fixed margin to be spent cautiously, but as a capability that can be built over time. And those are not necessarily my words, or my colleague Homi Karas's words, with whom I've been working on redefining fiscal space. Traditional approaches treat fiscal space as a narrow, finite margin within government budgets that can be used for priority spending without jeopardizing fiscal sustainability. And I think, and others now that I'm working with, think that this view is overly restrictive. It can instead be understood as a resource that can be expanded, particularly through investments that enhance social and environmental sustainability, which is what many of us care about. And when governments invest in areas that raise productivity, strengthen resilience, and reduce, I referred to earlier, that can create virtuous feedback loops that improve fiscal outcomes over a medium to longer term. And I think well-targeted public investment can relax supply constraints, can ease inflationary bottlenecks, which we are seeing, and reduce reliance on short-term interest rate hikes, because it expands productive capacity. And I think that's what we need to think about. Capturing these dynamics requires extending the time horizons for fiscal space beyond annual for near-term balance sheets. We need a longer-term time horizon, 5 to 10 years and so forth. And I think the more we can make these points in a fiscal policy context, the stronger will be. My friend Stephanie Seguino argues that a practical way to operationalize the shift is to evaluate fiscal choices against a longer run public sector budget constraint in which revenue rises with GDP. And that's an approach that actually reflects economic and fiscal returns of investments in such areas as care. And I do want to say something about care because I think it's important. This framing would see financing for investments in care services, social protection. This has long been argued even for health and education as an investment. It's an investment in social infrastructure. It is not current consumption and it is not current expenditure. And why? Because these investments generate economic returns, and economic returns that expand fiscal space and eventually bring more revenue into the public sector coffers, which I think is incredibly important. 2 more cents and I'll wrap up. In this compendium I mentioned, my friends Onar Onaran and Jem Oyvat find that public spending on care services and infrastructure in emerging markets, so not just the high-income countries, increases employment by about 6% and GDP by about 11% after 5 years. And I think that's really important, particularly if these are good jobs. Who would want to deny that kind of revenue into a public purse? Now, with those kinds of arguments, I think they're important for actors like the fund and the bank and UNDP and the various institutions I've worked with for a long time. But I also think these are really important arguments for civil society. And this is where I think the alliances between the kind of economic work that me and my colleagues and I are doing with civil society organizations like the IBP or Mtegha are really, really important, because we've got to start with that paradigm change, not accept some of the terms that are being forced on countries because of the short-term financial calculus.
Thank you. We're running out of time, unfortunately, and I'm going to save my my last question for the Q. But I want you to left thinking of how these 2 different approaches, more around a global fiscal architecture and the domestic on-the-ground challenges, regional and subnational, where do these approaches converge? Where do they touch, and where do they find common practical challenges that need to be solved? Because certainly will be a combination of both, but we would need to refine our conversation, our thinking, to find where does the global architecture meet the local needs in the map. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Gustavo, who will lead the next panel.
All right. We'll get started with this next panel. My name is Gustavo Flores Macias. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I very much appreciate the invitation. Many thanks to Andrés and Patricia for the opportunity to moderate this panel. I'll try to do the same thing that Andrés did, so masterfully try to keep everything to about 25 minutes. But let me just say that my own research on taxation has to do with the politics of tax reforms and the obstacles, the political obstacles. So I was especially excited to hear that the previous panel certainly touched on that. And then this panel will focus on the execution part of things, and how is it that we go from the budget plan to the reality of spending, and how we translate one into the other. So, we heard from Ana Patricia's presentation that the Open Budget Survey finds that governments, and this is, I think, really important, governments tend to provide less information and opportunities for participation and for scrutiny when they execute and spend their budgets than when they announce their budget proposals. So there's this gap between when the proposal is announced, how we're going to spend the money, and then how, it's actually happening midway. Just one example, the mid-year review designed to explain how a government has adjusted its priorities and spending at this halfway point in the year. is the least published of all of the key budget documents, right? And the survey finds that only 42% of countries surveyed actually produce this midpoint report. So this certainly makes it easier for governments to depart from the original spending patterns during the budget implementation. Now, the importance of this is that the budget implementation is where many promises actually succeed or fail. A budget may include funding for health, for education, for water, sanitation, for social protection. But if funds are delayed, if they're reallocated, if they remain unspent, they're purely procured or even not monitored, then the communities who do not receive these public services really bear the cost as a result. So in this panel, this conversation today, we'll discuss how to address these execution problems that get in the way of governments delivering, right? Delivering public goods, delivering on these results. So we'll showcase some good examples of how communities and government reform champions are working together to address expenditure issues, to inform, to monitor, to plan spending on key investments like health, like education, water, sanitation, and so on. Now, to help us explore these issues, it's my pleasure to introduce Chantayanan Devarajan, Professor of Practice of International Development, the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Shanta, you have often argued that services do not fail underserved communities only because governments.
They do fail underserved.
Well, let me. So you can argue, you've argued in the past that put it differently. It's not just about government spending too little, right? That it is also that there's an accountability that breaks down in how the funds that were originally budgeted are actually spent. Does that live up to your, what you thought I was going to say? Okay. So the question is, from your perspective, why is public spending often this weak predictor of whether services actually improve over time? In other words, where in the chain do resources most often fail to translate into delivery? And my focus of expertise is Latin America. I have in mind a very clear case, the case of Brazil, in which Brazil is the largest country in terms of expenditures on public education, but it's one of the worst performing countries in public education. So it's just certainly a salient example for me. Love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thanks very much. First of all, it's really a pleasure to be here. International Budget Partnership was like a dream back in the early 2000s when we were working on these issues of accountability in service delivery. So it's a real honor to see how far we've come and to discuss the next 20 years with you. Yes, so the problem with public spending, and Brazil is not an outlier. If you look at any systematic relationship between public spending in health and health outcomes, or public spending in education and education outcomes, and I emphasize outcomes, things like learning, you find it's almost, there's no correlation. There's no systematic relationship. And then the question is why? What is going on here? And you can roughly think of it in three ways, three terms. The first is within health and within education, if you look a little bit more closely, the spending is often geared towards the rich rather than the poor. So I'll give you one statistic. In India, if you look at the public health spending, 33% accrues to the richest 20%, the richest quintile, and less than 8% to the poorest quintile. That's because a lot of the spending is on hospitals, which is the big ticket item, and rich people want those hospitals located where they live, in the urban areas. And so the amount of money left for spending on primary health clinics, which benefits the poor, is much less. But it's worse than that, because if you then say, well, let's spend more on primary health clinics, you find that the money that is intended for the primary health clinic or the primary school is leaking somebody mentioned the grand leakage in the last session. This is a huge problem. Let me just give you one statistic on that. In Chad, they did a study about how much of the health spending ends up in the primary clinic, and it's less than 1%. 99% leakage. And if looking at other countries, it's comparable. It's not a pure outlier. But it's even worse than that, because suppose the money does get to the clinic or the primary school. The problem there is, what are the incentives for the providers to deliver services? So you find that in public primary schools in dozen African countries, 25% of the time the teacher is absent. It's the same in India and Bangladesh, by the way. So it's not surprising that the children aren't learning if the teacher is away 1 out of every 4 days. Furthermore, there's a problem of teachers not being qualified. We've also done a survey that 60% of the teachers in Tanzania, Kenya, and a few other, the 4th grade teachers don't even have the knowledge of a 4th grader. I mean, this is not even having the knowledge to teach them, but just what the level is of the 4th grader. So there are many slips between the cup and the lip in trying to translate budget allocations to service delivery outcomes that we all care about, particularly for the poor. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't be spending money, but we have to be changing the way we spend the money. We have to have ways in which we create incentives for teachers to actually show up to work. Create incentives for people down the chain to make sure that the money is transferred to the appropriate beneficiary. And also that there's more support for spending on things that matter for the poor rather than letting it be captured by the non-poor. These are things where transparency initiatives like the International Budget Partnership can actually make a difference. And we found that. I mean, if you actually publish these numbers about leakage, you actually see a decline in the leakage rate, right? Or you publish the numbers about teacher absenteeism, and you see a decline in absenteeism. So there are things that we can do, but we have to stop being, or we have to slow down in just saying, once we've got the money allocated, we're done, because we're not even close to being done.
Certainly. You know, you mentioned, I think, some great examples through the education, and we can picture sort of then the classrooms without teachers or absenteeism, these considerations. One of the things that I really appreciate about the work they do, and certainly the Open Budget Survey, is that it focuses on different stakeholders and not just the role of government, but also the communities. So my question is about the communities. Sort of what role can communities play in addressing these issues?
And absolutely, it can play a huge role. I'll give you a couple of examples. Actually, the first leakage study that was done back in the late 1990s by my colleague Ritva Renica, they found that the money that was meant for public primary schools that actually arrived at the school was 13%. And this, was horrifying. But the very interesting thing happened is that they published this number all over the place, the billboards and radio, newspapers, and everything else. Then people in the communities started demanding to know how much was coming to their district. And so the newspaper had to publish the amount of money that was coming. Once they found that out, they went to the school principal and said, okay, I see how much money you're getting. How come my kid says there's no furniture in the classroom, there are no textbooks? So the school then had to publish the school budget on the schoolroom door. And to this day, that's the case. And that number went from 13% to 90%, just by the public pressure. no fancy World Bank project or anything like that, that shifted it. Just to give you one other example, in health, it also happens to be in Uganda, but it's a very different case. They had the scheme where they published the quality of healthcare in each clinic. They would just post they would evaluate the quality of healthcare, and they'd post that clinic and the average for all the other clinics. So you can see whether this is above average or below average. And just by posting that, it started shifting people where people went to the clinics. And they actually did a very systematic study, one of these randomized control trials. And they found that actually that led to a decline in infant mortality. So you actually had better health outcomes simply by this posting of the information about the quality of care and the communities that drove the change.
Yeah, certainly. It reminds me of very interesting work that from behavioral economics, that it's sometimes not only the effect of monitoring, but sometimes even just a perception of being monitored.
That's right.
That really makes a difference, and the importance of transparency. Let me ask you about a case that you often point to, which is the case of Uganda. And certainly there are many other cases in which this information reaching the communities, I think, has shown to, a real difference. These examples, if you could speak to them, but specifically the question is, why is it in some cases the transparency seems to make a huge difference, and others not so much?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, because it's, what worked in Uganda didn't work in Uttar Pradesh, India, for instance, and other places. So, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is we economists in particular, I think information is always good, right? So we collect all this information and then we put it out there. But think of it from the point of view of the poor person. I mean, these people are working 12-hour days just to put food on the table. And then at the end of that 12-hour day, we're asking them to go to a town meeting and listen to people like us present these results so that they can hold governments accountable. I mean, this is a huge burden we're placing on people who have very little to begin with. So we have to be very careful. And I think that's what happens, is that in some cases, people just give up. They stop going to those town meetings, or they go just to keep us happy, but it doesn't really make any difference. I still remember this case in Uttar Pradesh where they developed these village education council, VEC, to motivate people to hold teachers accountable, and they'd have these meetings and everything else. This program had been going on for 10 years. And then they asked the people in the village, have you heard of the VEC? After 10 years, you'd think that they would have had, and 97% of them had never heard of it, right? Of the remaining 3 who could have heard of it, they asked them, can you name a single member of the VEC? And something like 80% of them could not. And that included people who were themselves members of the VEC. Okay. So I think we just overestimate the capacity of all this information being able to be processed.
Yeah, certainly. It is, my pleasure also to introduce Yinka, IBP's country director in Nigeria. And Yinka, we'll turn to you for the next question. I know your team has been working across 3 states in Nigeria to address budget execution challenges in the health sector in particular. I was hoping you could share with us, if you could tell us a little bit about the public finance management labs that your team has established. If you could share with us a little bit about the problems that you've identified, the budget information that was needed to understand the issues. If you could speak to, who do they bring together? What are they monitoring? How is this leading to better spending on primary health in Nigeria?
Thank you for the question, Gustavo. It's great to be joining virtually. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I wish I could be there physically, but alas, the visa ban on Nigeria. So, as a frame for my response, I will first of all state that IBP is a learning organization and we prioritize adaptability and continuous learning. And so the public financial management labs, they grow out of our learning from our budget credibility and Spark initiatives, which sought to build budget advocacy capabilities in community-based organizations. But over time, realized that just providing them with diagnostics on the variance between what is budgeted and what is released by the Ministry of Finance and utilized by line ministries, which our partners were using for advocacy, could go only so far in improving service delivery outcomes, which was our ultimate goal. So we went a step further to constitute PFM action labs in Oyo, Ogun, and Niger states to essentially give our partners insight into how services are delivered as budget line items move through the PFM pipeline. So from budget allocation to releases to procurement and then audit. And so we structured these labs so that they were small collaborative problem-solving platforms that brought together various actors, government, civil society, and community actors to diagnose and actually address budget execution bottlenecks. We focused on primary healthcare delivery, and our partners use several types of information to understand where these budget execution challenges lie. First of all, we build their capacity to analyze like macro level documents produced by government, so reports by the Office of the Accountant General and Auditor General in each state. And they were able to juxtapose that against micro or facility level data, information such as stock cards, cold chain storage uptimes, logs, supervision reports, so that they could identify how funds moved and where implementation stalled in ensuring that facilities are well stocked, staffed, and maintained. And so our partners were able to translate this complex budget data into concise, decision-ready material. So variance snapshots, infographics, two-page briefs, which helped the government actors and communities connect spending patterns to actual service results. So like I said, the labs brought diverse groups together. So we had community-based civil society organizations, we had government officials in both the PFM and service delivery line ministries. We also had community representatives. So for primary healthcare in Nigeria, we have ward development committees that, develop the budgets for facilities and ensure that those monies are spent. We also worked with the media through one of our partners, the International Center for Investigative Responsibility and Reporting, to host radio programs. And in some states, we worked with the state legislatures. And so in terms of actual results, the labs led to some states adopting more predictable fund release calendars and developing like simplified budget variance reports and clearer procurement standard operating procedures. Then these community dialogues between the State Primary Healthcare Board, which is responsible for primary healthcare, the CSO actors, and the communities became standardized and began to be adopted as part of everyday fiscal governance. And our hope is that over time, it will become embedded in understanding budget execution and ensuring that services reach the last mile. Just to give specific examples, in Ogun State, they were able to better integrate planning, budgeting, and procurement reforms. In Oyo State, we had more inclusive PHC staffing and insurance expansion efforts. So, for example, widows were included in the state healthcare insurance delivery schemes. And in Niger State, we actually saw like a full year release of funds from the federal government that go to primary healthcare delivery at the facility level, called the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund, through the follow-up work of our partners. So we're seeing a lot of results, and our hope is that a lot of these practices become embedded over time, and that dialogue between government, communities, and other actors continues. Thank you.
Thank you. And you, thank you. Okay, I'm glad you mentioned the community and sort of the role of the community, and I think this is something that Chantal also spoke to. Let me just close with a very quick question for both of you, and really, I mean, quick, maybe a minute and a half, perhaps. And this is just, what advice would you share with those who are trying to address budget execution challenges, whether it's in health or education, other sectors? And Yinka, maybe we'll start with you.
Thank you. So I'll say, firstly, we shouldn't underestimate the ability of communities and community-based CSOs to drive change from the bottom up, right? They are already doing effective advocacy, and if we equip them with the right skills and knowledge and the tools, it dials up their efforts to another level, and they're able to speak knowledgeably about budget execution challenges in a manner that not only holds the attention of government officials, but actually opens doors for them to contribute meaningfully to discussions on how public finances are managed to provide last mile services. Secondly, I would say we shouldn't overestimate the propensity of government officials to serve as roadblocks to progress. So sometimes we see them as being corrupt, malign influences, but sometimes their inability to deliver services is due to information asymmetry. So they assume that because funds have been released, services are being provided. And this is where community-generated data and evidence helps to create a holistic picture. And then many government officials are open to collaboration once they are assured they will not be publicly shamed. And then lastly, public finances and the policies and systems that transform them into public goods and services are foundational to the attainment and sustainability of any development goal whatsoever. And it's especially in the current context where development aid is shrinking and there's need for sustainability in transferring ownership for solving country problems from development partners to country governments. So if we don't fix these systems and build demand side capacity, especially at the level of the community to hold government accountable, that culture of dependency that we all complain about will become entrenched and development gains will be easily reversed. So I would say that we should shift from quick wins, low-hanging fruits to investing in long-term initiatives that transform public finance systems to vehicles for equitable and effective service delivery. Thank you.
Thank you, Yinka. Chantal, same question.
Same question.
What advice would you have?
In a minute and a half. So I think it's been said already. I would say build as many coalitions as you can to bring this about. And that includes what Yinka was saying earlier, which is coalitions within government, because there will be an adversarial relationship to some of this information by government, but there may be people within government who are actually reformers who are looking for this kind of information and this kind of support to further their progress. But then I would say, civil society, absolutely, community groups. One other thing that hasn't been said, actually, except in a negative way by Karen, which is the private sector. Because one thing that I've been impressed with, I've been working on debt restructuring for Sri Lanka for the last 5 years, is the extent to which the bondholder community and the private sector actually is looking for fiscal transparency. They don't want to be blindsided by a sudden increase in the debt of a country. And so they actually, I know they've been asking me, what are the systems in place in Sri Lanka for budget transparency if we're going to restructure the debt, because we don't want to get caught ourselves. So they are a huge ally. And I think you gave the example of Benin earlier. I think Benin, thanks to this work, is now floating government bonds, sovereign bonds. So this actually helps them in the capital markets. And so they could be an ally as well in trying to further fiscal transparency.
Thank you. It's very clear that it requires a collective, sorry, I think now my volume is really high. a collective effort, including so many stakeholders, certainly governments on one hand, but civil society, and not just sort of NGOs, but also private sector, different actors. Yinka and Shanta, thank you so much again. Please join me in thanking them for these. And I'll invite Ana Patricia, or yes, please.
Thank you so much. We'll have to skip the Q&A, unfortunately, but really wonderful, thought-provoking panel. I think everything's been said, and shaking a little bit our pre-assumptions, giving us a little more of the longer-term view, shifting narratives, but also shifting paradigms, and questioning what is transparency for and who it benefits. Just the last sentence in that the private sector also cares, and this is also good for them. So there's no contradiction from what we heard between equity and efficiency and growth. And those are the assumptions that we need to take in the next phase of the work. So what I would like to do in a couple of minutes is a few things just to let you know that exactly because of the things we heard today, the Open Budget Survey will be changing, will be evolving. We would like to use new technologies and efficiency in the research phase for the transparency score. And we're going to flip the effort, the time, the money that we invest in really focusing on what comes next, on those coalitions that are going to drive change, on measuring whether services are delivered. And to do so, we need to change things. So hopefully you're going to be part of this new journey as well. I think it's important, therefore, to look into the past, to be able to look into the future. So I really would like to thank everyone who has been supporting this work for over the past 20 years. Many of you who are here, there, and who are there in that meeting, who there put civil society in the budget work. So Warren Kravchik was here, who was the beginning of it all, to all the IBP staff that have been working on this, building this movement really over time, and our team, the team that is here, that is on the screen in over 12 countries, IVP staff is located. A big thank you to all of you. And last but not least, there are more than 120 civil society partners that you see them now rolling on the screen. You probably won't have time to see them all, that have worked tirelessly every year to put out the information and then to engage with governments. So we heard there's a lot of challenges, but I think what I would like to do is to leave us all with a sense of hope and possibility. And it's not to make you feel a little bit better today. It's really the hope that I see every day in the concrete changes, in the increase in budget execution and allocation, in the better healthcare services that people who have never been part of these conversations are now getting. And this is the bar that we're putting ourselves. This is a challenge that we are committed to change in the future. Thank you all so much, and hopefully you'll take some time to walk around, speak among each other, speak with our great colleagues at IBP. Thank you.